So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my forthcoming book. It officially is released on March 30th. Let me know if you can't see my screen. It seems to be, Teams seems to be jumping up, but it looks like it's okay.
Yeah.
So today I'll talk a little bit about my book. It's really been about a decade in the making, more or less. A lot of the ideas really came when I first started visiting Cambodia in 2009, and have been working on parts of the book for over the past decade. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what's in the book, some of the main arguments, and give you a little insight into my thinking here. So the book is called Cambodia for Sale, which might be a little provocative, but it's not really about the sale of Cambodia, as some people might assume. It is about everyday privatization in education, and thinking a bit beyond education as well, looking at how privatization is a social practice. And so I think for me, the real conundrum started when I visited Cambodia, and I would see images, or when I would visit schools all over the country, and I would see things like this, where this is a very typical Cambodian classroom, and there's a few things that stick out right away. And for those who have been to Cambodia, they'll probably recognize them, but for those who have not, the teacher at the front there, she is wearing a typical Cambodian teacher's outfit. The students are wearing typical Cambodian student outfits with a white top and blue slacks or skirts. You see a board at the front. You see a raised platform where the teacher stands, which is a legacy of the French schooling system. You see names of students on the left, to the left of the board, the students of the month. And you can see that the one student is a little bit higher in the middle, and that's the top student in the class. You see sayings on the walls above the windows. You see the picture of the royal family and the flag of Cambodia. You see a few images of Angkor Wat, the famed temple in Cambodia. And this, in many ways, is a generic representation of what schools look like around Cambodia. Now, of course, there'll be differences depending on how a teacher decorated her or his room. But generally speaking, this is very, very common, this particular photo. And what's striking is when you compare what is going on in classrooms next door or just a few hours later. So this photo was taken on a Tuesday, and on a Wednesday morning, this photo was taken. And it's the same teacher, and a subset of the students are in that classroom. And so this is an auxiliary room in the school, and so it's not an actual classroom, so there's nothing hanging on the walls like before. You don't see the same sort of seats. The students are wearing something very different. You don't see the white shirts and the blue bottoms. They're wearing sort of what they would wear every day outside of school. The teacher is wearing the same outfit. She's still the government school teacher, but this is the private tutoring. This is where students are learning content on the national curriculum. In this case, it's a physics class that wasn't taught in mainstream schooling, or was partly taught in mainstream schooling. And it's the same teacher with the same students in the same school building, in a separate room. Sometimes it's in the exact same room. And it's this phenomenon that really struck me. How do we begin to explain why this happens? We know all sorts of things about how much money is collected, what subjects are taught, but I wanted to know more about how do we even begin to explain this phenomenon that repeats itself in virtually every school. Maybe it looks slightly different in really remote schools where you don't have as much demand by students for tutoring, and it might look different in really urban schools where it's a bit, well, more market related, where there might be big businesses associated with tutoring. But in rural and semi-rural schools, this scene is repeated over and over and over again. And so that's what this conundrum basically was, the impetus for this book, trying to figure out how do we begin to explain these two photos, to really break it down. And of course, as in most things related to Cambodia, most people would start here, which is the Khmer Rouge, the genocidal regime that was in power between 1975 and 1979. They were in power for fewer than 4 years, but of course had devastating effects. Nearly 2 million people died under the regime through starvation or execution or exhaustion, as the picture on the right would show. And of course, the Khmer Rouge, the sort of civil unrest that we might associate with the Khmer Rouge existed long before they came to power and existed after they left power. And in many respects, people say that the country reached stability in the 1990s, more or less. And the chaos probably began. It's all connected to the French Indochina War in Vietnam and later the American War in Vietnam, and a lot of socialist and royalist and republican factions of power were fighting each other in Cambodia, and so the unrest was decades long. And so this sort of post-conflict society that emerged in the 1990s is really part of the explanation that we have to understand to begin to understand the two pictures that I started with at the beginning. But after the Khmer Rouge fell from power in 1979, and no Western power was really admitted into the country in the 1980s, it was mostly Vietnam support as well as USSR was supporting the country at the time. As well as a few other socialist countries. And there was very few researchers that were writing in English there at that moment. But one who was there said this about what the country looked like in 1979. And she writes, Cambodia had no currency, no markets, no financial institutions, and virtually no industry. There was no public transport system, no trains ran, and the roads were damaged and unrepaired. There was no postal system, no telephones, and virtually no electricity, clean water, sanitation, or education. Virtually, the state disappeared. At the end of 1979, one of the mottos of the Khmer Rouge was to bring the country to year zero, and any sort of modern institution was seen as a colonial legacy from the French, and needed to be removed to create an agrarian utopia. That was sort of the intent of the Khmer Rouge. And so when the Khmer Rouge left power, there really was nothing of what we might consider as a modern nation state. And so in a way, if you think of education as being completely destroyed to the pictures I showed you that was probably 2010, 2011, it's a huge difference. There is a system of education. There is a curriculum. There's near universal primary education. Many children even make it to secondary school, huge numbers, and those numbers are increasing. So in many ways, this is a tremendous success story of what we might call publicization. And so here's just one representation of rebuilding an education system after conflict. And this just goes from 2000 to 2018, but shows government expenditures as a percent of recurrent expenditures on education. And, in 2000, it was below 14%, and by 2018, it's above 20%. I mean, that's a huge change, and we need to commend the government for what it has done. Teacher salaries have increased, more school buildings have been built, more children have gone into school, curriculum has been reformed. Yes, there was a big decline during the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and it took a while for the country to get out of that. They're worried about what's happening with COVID now, but from my understanding, the government wants to put even more money into education as a response to COVID. So that number of 20% should go up. So this, in many ways, is Cambodia is an example of building a public system of education. But yet that picture still exists of a private space of schooling. So how do we begin to explain that? It doesn't necessarily, you would assume that if this public system could be built up, you would see less and less of this private space of private tutoring. And so on the other hand, then, you have to consider that what has happened in Cambodia post-conflict is actually a process of potentially privatization. And so in 1995, Mark Bray showed that, in primary schools, in primary education, households were spending 80% of costs on education, and the government was only spending 20%. And that might make sense in a post-conflict country. There, the country held free and fair elections in 1992 and 1993, and they basically had a democratically elected government. I mean, some people might disagree with that, but there was an election for the first time in many decades, and they needed to rebuild themselves after decades of conflict. And so this might be expected in 1999, and by 2005, 10 years later, we see a decrease, and that's a positive thing potentially. We see the households only spending 60%, but the government spending 40%. But interestingly, 12 years later, the numbers haven't budged, more or less. They've basically stayed the same. And so why is that, despite the massive increase in government spending on education? So we have to potentially think that there's something happening that is continuing the process of privatization, or at least keeping it maybe stagnant to some extent. And so we still need to begin to understand why this is happening. And so tutoring, private tutoring, of course, becomes one of the main expenditures that you need to really begin to unpack. And so in the book, this is what I'm trying to do, and show tutoring in some of its complexity. But before we look at tutoring specifically, let's just think, what are households actually spending money on? I mean, it's huge amounts of money that is being spent in a relatively poor country. The country has certainly increased its GDP per capita over the last few decades, but it's still, I mean, even today, it's considered a low middle income country. So what are people spending money on in education? Well, school contributions, this can be households giving money to communities households giving money to schools to maybe build buildings or build a fence or level the land, or some sort of contribution. Maybe it's for building a toilet or creating wash facilities, whatever it is. School uniforms, as you saw, those are nationally mandated but not nationally provided. So households have to actually buy uniforms, and so there's a big market. You can go to most markets in Cambodia and find uniforms for sale. School equipment, that would be desks and maybe whiteboards or chalkboards, pencils, paper, whatever it is. Sometimes schools have a very small budget for these items from the government, and so they ask households to contribute to pay for these expenses. Examination papers, this is a very strange and complicated story, but basically the gist of it is most schools don't have a photocopier, and so if you have to give an examination to students, how do you actually create the examination on a piece of paper? And so what ends up happening is schools will make examination papers, or a teacher, her or himself, will sort of make an examination and then photocopy it and then sell those examination papers to students before they can go and take the exam. And so, of course, if you don't buy the examination paper, you're going to fail the exam. So it's an interesting sort of social injustice that emerges through some of these fees. There's transportation costs. I mean, the big one is like bike parking. So many schools, if you were to ride your bicycle to the school, which is quite common in rural Cambodia, to park your bike on school grounds, you'd have to pay a small amount of money to basically park and have your bike watched by someone. But it is a way that many schools raise money to support school activities. Pocket money. So most schools will have things like a little canteen, or like a little stall where someone from the community is selling some food or snacks, or maybe pencils and paper, and so students usually go to school with a little bit of pocket money to buy lunch or whatever it is. Gifts to teachers, it's quite a common tradition to give a teacher something out of respect, because they do sit in a pretty high social position. And then finally, private tutoring. And this is probably the biggest cost that households have. And And there's many different types of private tutoring. I've detailed this in other work. I'm not going to go into it here. I'm just going to talk about it generally as private tutoring for now. But just what do we know about private tutoring generally? Some of the work I've done with a few colleagues, we showed that about 60% of lower secondary school students attended private tutoring. Another group of researchers from the World Bank found that 87% of lower secondary school teachers engaged in private tutoring. So that's quite a large number of teachers giving tutoring as a way of topping up their salaries to earn, at the time when that was written, teacher salaries were quite low. And so tutoring became a common second job for teachers. Another World Bank report later on and just recently said that 73% of grade 8 students said they attended private tutoring. So a few, more than what I found 7 years earlier. So potentially increasing over time. And then another report around the same time I did it basically said that 47% of parents said that they send their child to private tutoring. So across the board, basically tutoring is quite common. A lot of parents send their children to tutoring. A lot of children go to tutoring, and a lot of teachers tutor. It's a very, very common everyday practice. And so that picture I saw at the beginning that I showed you is not unusual in any respects. It's very, very common. Just to give you some of the most recent data on private tutoring, national data on private tutoring from a household survey that's conducted every few years, basically shows that 20% of primary school students go to tutoring, 57% of lower secondary school, so grades 7, 8, and 9, and nearly 75% of students in upper secondary school or high school, basically grades 10, 11, and 12, go to tutoring. My understanding is that since COVID has happened, and Cambodia has closed schools, moved things online quite quickly, tutoring has skyrocketed, and now a lot of tutoring is happening online. It's a really new phenomenon. I've been looking at it. I don't actually talk about it too much in this book because when I was doing my research, it simply didn't exist, online tutoring. I have the wheel of death, and now I can't actually go to the next slide. Oh, wait, here we go. Sorry. So I'm still left with the question, how can we explain privatization when the government has tried to strengthen public education for 30 plus years, right? I mean, it's quite amazing that the percentage, the amount, the scale of tutoring has persisted over time. And there might have been, there's examples of certain fees that Cambodia used to levy inside schools. The big one used to be enrollment fees, and that one has now more or less disappeared. You do not see an enrollment fee charged by schools to get children into school. It's been outlawed and it's been successful, but yet you still see huge amounts of money, private money, being spent on education in private tutoring, and most of the private tutoring is by public school teachers on the public curriculum, and so it's a really strange element or example of privatization that doesn't disappear despite the efforts of the government. And so that's something that basically I explore in the book to try and figure out why this is the case. And what I argue is that you can't simply start from the Khmer Rouge as being the sort of historical starting point to think through privatization. You actually have to go a bit further back. So the top left picture that you see is a French colonial architecture building in Phnom Penh. But to me, you have to go back to French colonialism to begin to understand the way in which the school was set up, the way in which the examination systems were set up, and to begin to see how education functions. You also, the bottom left is basically, it's the Silver Pagoda, which is in Phnom Penh as well, but to me it symbolizes the role of Buddhism and Buddhist education in particular in the country. And you have to think through how the Buddhist education system intersects with the sort of modern mass schooling system that we know of today and that's run by the state. So for me, it's a religious side, a colonial side, as well as the Khmer Rouge side. And then more recently, you have to understand the United Nations Transitional Authority of Cambodia, UNTAC, which the picture on the right symbolizes, which is a really interesting moment in the UN. It was sort of the beginning or the heart of liberal internationalism, where at the end of the Cold War, liberal capitalism sort of prevails, and institutions like the United Nations feel as if they can have the power to go to countries that have not adopted certain state structures and help create the trade liberalization, the free and fair elections, organizing countries in particular ways. And Cambodia basically became the first experiment where this happened in the 1990s. And the UN took over the country for 2 years. And there's a lot of history to talk about in there, and I won't go into it too much, but I think you also have to understand that particular moment in time to begin to understand the way in which privatization operates in the country today. So in other words, taking a more holistic historical approach is needed rather than just to focus in on the Khmer Rouge, which I admit is very important, but I think it's more complex than that. So what did I come out with then is that I basically was thinking about the social life of privatization. That's more or less where the book, the way in which I view privatization is in that everyday experience of people inside a village rather than at the policy level, which is often the case, particularly in Cambodia, where there's very few policies at the national level that might indicate a level of privatization. There is school-based management, and so there might be an argument to make that school-based management is sort of a policy that enables privatization. But other than that, at the secondary and primary level, there's very, very few. Higher education is different. They do allow fees and private institutions, and that's a different story. So, but what I do is I basically try and theorize education privatization as a social construction. It's socially produced through the action and interactions of individuals and institutions. We produce privatization rather than see it as something that is sort of enacted by policy. But I think it's also beyond what people like Tony Verger have called de facto privatization. So de facto privatization being the idea that when a state cannot provide something, then local communities basically provide it for themselves. And then once the state can provide it, you sort of see de facto privatization disappear. And I would argue that that's not exactly what's happening in Cambodia. There might be elements of it, but given that the country has seen such a massive increase in public expenditures on education and a publicization in many respects, it's quite amazing that you still continue to see private tutoring persist in the country. And so I don't think it's necessarily de facto. I think it's actually socially produced. People want it and are creating it and maybe potentially co-creating it. So then I also conceptualize education privatization as being embedded in other social and cultural systems. So it's not just sort of seeing education as school, but also seeing issues like the healthcare system, the local government, even the pagoda system, where there's lots of elements of collecting donations as part of sort of building merit in the Buddhist sense. But that money is then sort of repurposed and redistributed for different developmental aspects inside villages. And so I think there's a lot of interconnections between these social systems that actually not only create privatization, but make it legitimate. So again, fees aren't only collected in schools. And then, of course, to historicize it beyond the Khmer Rouge. So it is post-conflict, but it's also, we have to think about development legacies from colonialism, from Buddhism, and from the liberal internationalism, as I said. And tutoring did emerge in the 90s. I'll talk a little bit more about this soon. I think it does matter that the tutoring that we know did emerge in the 1990s. It didn't exist previously, and I think that's an important insight to try and think why that is the case. So the social life of privatization continued. So what I do in the book is actually I draw on a lot of anthropological literature of village life, and there's some really great research that has been done. So I'm trying to not only bring together the education literature on privatization, for instance, but I'm also trying to say, okay, what is it about Cambodian village life that makes it possible to see privatization as a social construction? And if you read the anthropological literature on Cambodia, you quickly come to the conclusion that there's a few big ideas that are found in Cambodian village life. One is clientelism, the idea of patron-client networks. So there are patrons that protect a group of clients, and those clients basically give something to that patron in return for the protection. And it becomes quite elaborate. So you can be a patron in one situation and a client in another. And so, for instance, a teacher is certainly a patron of her or his students, and those students do give something back to that teacher, either a gift to say thank you to the teacher. It could be respect by bowing to the teacher, by referring to the teacher in more formal ways. But it also could be given money to the teacher through the private tutoring lessons. We also know that there's great social hierarchy in Cambodian village life. I mean, the country has something called God Kings that sit at the top of the country, and they're sort of a living god, and everything basically falls under that God King. And there's a strong social hierarchy. You know your place in that hierarchy. Today, I would argue that it's not the king who sits at the top of that social hierarchy anymore, but the Prime Minister of Cambodia, Hun Sen, who's been in power for over 35 years now. So I would argue he's sort of the new God King, the modern God King of the country. But the idea, the system persists. It's not disappearing in any sense of social hierarchy. And we also know that there's particular forms of kinship in the country, and particularly in villages. And basically this kinship sort of extends beyond your blood relations. So would include people outside of your family, but within your village in particular. You feel very, very close and interconnected to people in your village. So it's embedded in other systems, as I said, so healthcare, local government, religious institutions, I've sort of talked about this, and historicizing privatization. So it definitely was de facto, particularly in the immediate post-conflict, but it does then intersect with this issue of liberal internationalism of the 1990s, which just so happens to intersect with this education for all movement, which was really pushing a lot of children into schools and putting great pressure on the public system of education worldwide, and has been linked to private tutoring in other contexts as well. So I think all of this you have to really begin to understand to make sense of those two pictures I showed at the beginning of the class, or of the seminar. And what I end up finding basically is that there's enduring legacies of privatization as a social practice, despite the public policy changes that are creating public education. And so I think it's a really fascinating story that can be shown on how a country can sort of create public systems of education, but despite all of that great effort, we still see persistence of privatization, or the social construction of privatization, I should say. And so what do I do in the book? Basically, I create life portraits. I tell life stories and biographies of 6 individuals, all living in the same exact village. And so the first is the teacher that you met earlier in the 2 photos in the beginning. So I worked with her. I sat in on many of her classes. I interviewed her. I learned her whole story to think about how she navigates both the public and private space of schooling. I spoke and worked with an NGO school director. So there's a few NGO schools set up inside of this community. And so it's not part of the public school, but it is a public, or it is a space of education that exists in the country. And so I worked with him very closely to understand how he sees education, how he funds his NGO, how he sees the purpose and value of schooling and what he does in relation to the education of children in the village. I worked with the pagoda layman, so the person in charge of the pagoda committee. He's a very, very well-respected individual in the community. He lived through the Khmer Rouge. He survived the Khmer Rouge very successfully. He never had one person in his family killed during that time. He's a very, very smart man, very kind, very welcoming. But he really showed how the pagoda was a huge social institution in communities and how they actually participate in the development process. And he goes around and collects money from people in the village. So then the pagoda committee can go and do various development projects. I worked with a government official in the community from the local council, and he is from the opposition party, so not the party of Hun Sen. And he basically showed me a lot of what it meant to be an opposition politician at a local level, and in particular things like government fees that are levied for things like having a wedding or traffic tickets, whatever it is that are sort of levied locally. He showed how if you are a voter of the opposition party, the fees you pay are a lot higher than if you are a voter of the ruling party, the Cambodian People's Party. Then the fees are typically a lot lower. They also do charge fees based on sort of what you wear and how you look. I also worked with a sort of a town elder, so someone who's lived in this village his entire life. He actually grew up doing about 12 years of Buddhist pagoda schooling. He spoke French fluently before the Khmer Rouge happened. And so in a way, he represents someone who had a huge amount of education before the Khmer Rouge, and then during the Khmer Rouge, he saw it get completely destroyed. And then he saw basically from his children and now his grandchildren the slow progress of what has happened inside the village, the opportunities that have been created for children over time. And so for him, he sees all of these different spaces, what I might call privatized education, he sees as positive, that there's nothing wrong with it in his mind. In fact, he's very happy, and he sees that Cambodian villages are finally reaching what it used to be like when he was a child growing up in that same village. So for him, it's very much a story and history of progress from the Khmer Rouge in particular. But of course, I pair that with a woman and her family and the struggle she goes through that are the exact opposite. She sees, has huge amounts of inequality. She feels completely oppressed, and the fees are, horrendous. She blames that she's a voter of the opposition party, and so she ends up being sort of penalized for that and not given different aid and benefits in the community. And to the point where she actually even has to illegally migrate to Thailand during the time I was working with her, simply to try and earn more money that she could then send back so her children could pay the fees to go to school. So it's not a happy story from her point of view. So across these 6 different people, the idea was that we're able to start seeing a real complexity of how educational privatization works at the village level, which then the idea is that it can be extracted across the nation. So just some quick findings, and I'll end soon. Tutoring did emerge in the 1980s for adults, but it actually massified for children by 1992, which is, connected to EFA and also connected to that liberal internationalism that we find. But because there's different types of tutoring, what we end up finding is that tutoring really does reproduce the social hierarchy. So if you're someone who has more money, you have more choices to afford different types and potentially of better quality tutoring. And so in many ways, tutoring becomes this way of reproducing the social hierarchy, even though all of these, everyone can get access to mainstream schooling for free. There's still ways to differentiate who gets better education, and tutoring becomes a way of for that to work. Teachers who tutor, really fascinating information on sort of how relationships change depending on if you're in the private tutoring space or the public space. And so, teachers in the public school, the one I worked with, she really showed me how you have to balance this these relations of kinship, because she very much feels like the mother to these children in this community. They're very much part of her family. And so she is actually supposed to treat those children in a much more strict way. Corporal punishment is, very much demanded by the community for children. But she has to balance that also with the sort of pedagogical trends that are being demanded by the ministry and all the different international donors. So particularly something like child-friendly schools, teacher or child-centered pedagogies, these sort of ideas. And there's a real balance that has to be made in public school. Whereas in private tutoring, what's interesting is you actually end up seeing what I would call the market relation taking hold, where the teacher actually has to be very friendly with students, have to treat them more like friends, has to provide them something, does take money, but has to do it in this really weird way where the teacher doesn't actually accept the money directly from the students, because she's also she still wants to have respect from the community. And so she asks a student to collect the money, and then that student gives it to her after class in a discreet way. And so there's these really complex relationships that these teachers have to navigate and balance. In terms of NGO schools, what's interesting is that we find that the funding models, this one that I worked with, really changed over time. They charged students fees. They then charged, they tried to do it for free. And now, of course, they're using international donors. And so in a way, we've globalized school funding at these NGO levels, which really creates these new forms of power relations. So the donors become the ones that have a lot of say inside this NGO school. And so there's all sorts of compromises that I show that the NGO school has had to make in terms of the preferred pedagogy that it wants to provide its students because of the demand from these donors. And so it's a really fascinating tale of balancing these sort of local and global demands on schooling and finance. We also see about poor cards. Poor cards are a social service or sort of a welfare program that the country has enacted that basically says if you are considered poor, you can get this poor card 1 or poor card 2, which basically gives you different types of benefits. So, you might get free healthcare, or you might get first in line to get aid from the international community, be it chickens or growing seeds or rice, bags of rice, whatever it is. But what we see is that the definition of what it means to be poor is sort of politically constructed, and these cards are allocated very much on political grounds by the local government authorities. And so it's a really interesting insight onto what it means to be poor and how the politics work out on a local level. And so it very much basically shows that a lot of the fees are about a form of clientelism. I have the wheel of death again. Hang on, give me a sec. I'm almost done, I promise you. Just need this wheel of death. Okay, and then again, the other thing is that religious institutions are a major source of village development. They have been for a long time, before the Khmer Rouge, and then certainly after the Khmer Rouge. And so there is a huge amount of legitimacy, and when the community collects money, or the pagoda collects money for the community, it builds merit, and it ultimately helps build roads, fill potholes. A lot of the money sometimes is used for school development. And so it's a really interesting sort of side of education development that perhaps doesn't get enough attention. And in a strange way, you end up seeing these, particularly through the religious institutions, you see a de facto tax system forming. that, you know, it's not coming from the government, but because it's coming from a respected institution within villages, it's very much socially legitimate, and in many ways it's progressive because it's what you can afford. And so it's usually wealthier people will give more money to the pagoda than poorer people. And so in a way, it's actually quite a progressive de facto tax system, which is, in my mind, hopeful in a way. So the big takeaway, again, is that social practices constitute educational privatization as much as, if not more than, the various policies with which privatization is typically associated. And so I think the study of education privatization needs to include more of these ethnographic studies to complement some of the really rich policy studies that we've done around the world, more or less. But I think it's really important to draw on that anthropological literature across the world, in different communities, and try and understand how privatization is a social practice. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments and hope we can have a nice discussion.